Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. South Africa is one of the major emerging markets in the African continent and is becoming increasingly important in the bloc of BRICS nations. So what role does South Africa play in the grouping, and how can China and South Africa in multiple fields to benefit both nations? What are the challenges South Africa is facing regarding its economy? To answer these questions and more, I'm very happy to have an exclusive interview with Gwede Mantashe, Secretary General of the African National Congress, the ruling party of South Africa. But before we start the interview, let's look at this.
Born in 1955 in Kala in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa, Gwede Mantashe was the Secretary General of the National Union of Mine Workers until their 12th National Conference held in May 2006, where he was succeeded by Frans Barleni. He made history by becoming the first trade unionist to be appointed to the board of directors of a Johannesburg Stock Exchange Limited listed company, namely Samancor, in 1995. In 2007, Mantashe was elected as chairperson of the South African Communist Party and also served as a member of the party's Central Committee. At the 52nd ANC National Conference held in December 2007, he was elected as the Secretary General of the ANC. In 2012, at the SACP National Congress, Mantashe stepped down as its chairman. He was, however, at the same Congress, elected into the Central Committee of the party. In the same year, at the 53rd National Conference of the ANC in Mangwang, he was re-elected as the Secretary General of the ANC. In 2011, as the head of delegation of ANC senior cadres, Gwede Mantashe paid a visit to China and was welcomed by Xi Jinping. Just this month, he has attended the CPC's Dialogue with the World in Chongqing to cover political party roles in the innovation of global economic governance.
Welcome to Dialogue, Your Excellency. What do you think are the most important issues in addressing what we call global governance?
The most important thing is a relationship. Countries must have good relationship and be able to communicate with each other. Because if there's communication, you can have mutual relationship in trade and in business. You can address the needs of the people of the countries in a relationship. If we don't do that, global governance is not going to work. The second one is appreciation of the fact that countries are not at the same level of development. Those that are developed must have some responsibility of pulling the poor countries up so that there is common prosperity in the world and there will be less tensions. The last one is the fact that there should be no dominance of one by another. The relationship should be of equal partners in all the trade relations.
The issues that we have NAFTA, the European Union, the OECD countries, and the G7 club. At the same time, we have the BRICS as well as the G20. Which do you think is the most important, promising platform for addressing issues of common concern on an equal footing? That somehow goes back to what you said, good relationship and without the absolute dominance of the platform by a single superpower.
The first one is the G20 is quite important because it's a group of countries that can help balance the world. But I attach special price to the BRICS in the sense that it's an association of three developing countries representing regions. For example, if you take South Africa in BRICS, in terms of size of the economy and the size of the population, it should not be a member. But once South Africa becomes an entry to Africa, it becomes an appropriate member. If you take Russia, for example, it is going through a difficult period. The five countries that are involved there, China and India have a consumption power and they can lead the growth of BRICS. Brazil is going through a very difficult period. They've just seen the impeachment of a president who is legitimately elected, replaced by a blind one to the West. But the problem with that is, again, the question of power relations determine the importance of each one of those groups. The developed economies are very suspicious of BRICS. They think that it is going to create an alternative instead of creating a complementing power that can help them deal with development problems in the world.
With the end of the Cold War, the United States of America remains the sole superpower.
Yeah.
So President Obama said it's the US, not China, which should write the rules for economies that should operate in a rule-based world. Now, does what he says give any ring of truth?
Now, the problem with the United States has become a marshal of the world since the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and therefore dictate rules everywhere. If they knew about rules, we would still be having Libya today, and not the chaos that we're seeing. We would still be having Iraq today, not the chaos we're seeing. We would still be having Afghanistan today, and not the chaos that we're witnessing there. There would be no hybrid war in Syria. My own view is that Western powers led by the United States will never be champions of peace and development. They have no friends, they have only interests, and that makes them different to China. At least China, the second biggest economy of the world, still deal with developing economies as friends and pay attention to mutual benefit of the relationship. To me, that is what is important.
But I'm afraid, if you look at the UN Charter, Human Rights Declaration, for example, these are the legacy of the post-war reconstruction. Those in the West are convinced that universal values, such as freedom of whatever, should be the sole standard in judging whether you are correct or not.
The reality is that the world is not a homogeneous place where everybody see values from the same angle. What is important for global peace is respecting the values of the different nations and develop rules that accommodate all of them. If we're not able to do that, we'll still have a third world war into the future. But if we begin to respect each other, understand each other's value, we can be guaranteed of peace. For example, let me show you the UN Security Council. UN Security Council reflects the past, not the future, until it is amended. At this point in time, it is having 5 countries that have both veto powers. Other countries and other regions are not even represented. And that is actually rules based on domination and power. And that will never guarantee us growth of countries to the same level and coexistence and peace.
But the problem, I'm afraid, lies within our brothers and sisters in Africa itself. For example, both South Africa and Nigeria, if not Egypt, are competing for the same position in the UN Security Council, yet another permanent member other than the current 5. And therefore, you have to first of all decide among the Africans themselves who should be the first in the pecking order.
My own view is that the African Union is the platform to resolve that problem. It's not a major problem. It's not an insurmountable problem. That can be resolved, but Africa must have a representative. But a representative of Africa in the UN Security Council should not be a pliant regime in Africa that will nurse the interests of the West. It must represent the interests of the African continent. And that is one of the criteria that should be looked into. If you put South Africa or you put Nigeria or you put Egypt, I would discount Egypt from the word go and say maybe Nigeria and South Africa, but get a country that will represent the interests of the African continent.
China and South Africa share some similar history in terms of colonialism, being oppressed by Western powers one way or another. We not only share some of the same past, but we aspire to look into the future in a similar way. China, for example, stands for the principle of being inclusive, co-prosperous, and interconnected in the age of globalization. Do you buy this idea, especially after the G20 summit in September in Hangzhou, capital city of Zhejiang province?
Our history is common. The ANC, for example, which is the governing party in South Africa, is 9 years older than the CPC. But the CPC got their freedom much earlier. We got ours very late. There's still a lot for South Africa to learn from China. China can be an experiment that we can look into, in the sense that it has been able to adapt. It came out of a struggle for freedom, got freedom, it went through a period, but it rediscovered itself, introduced a new system. Socialism with the Chinese characteristics is very innovative. It's a combination of the humane content of socialism and the innovative and the approach which is on free market in a big way. And it is a big player in global economies, and that combination works well for China.
Bretton Woods may not yet come to an end. That's the post-war financial system that was built by the United States and other Western powers. President Xi Jinping says we are more interested in the Belt and Road Initiative to cover development of infrastructure in mostly developing countries. Do you think this is inclusive enough to help Africans with their industrialization?
The most important part will be the fine print. For example, I'm a great believer that Africa must be taken out of pit to pot type of economies, where they mine, put it on the rail line to the port, process it somewhere else. I'm a great believer that what we produce in Africa should be processed in Africa. We must add value, export our products with value added. At this point in time, our trade relations are not balanced in the sense that we, in the main, export raw material, bulk commodities, we import manufactured goods. In the process, we export a large number of the much needed jobs. And in the discussion with China, which is more friendly in terms of engagement and will be more considerate in terms of our needs.
When we look at the issue of governance, let's go back to what happened some 20 years ago when South Africa not only put an end to racial apartheid, but also got more independent through democratic elections. And Nelson Mandela became the iconic symbol of freedom and the democracy in this fight against the Western colonialism. So do you think democracy is more of the solution or problem in addressing the issue of efficiency and poverty alleviation, as well as creating more jobs for young South Africans?
You see, if you take to our situation, which I know firsthand, is that we spend a lot of time talking. We delay taking decisions. It's not the most efficient way of doing things. We must find a way of accelerating decision making and execution. At this point in time, ultra-democracy that we have in South Africa is important in terms of allowing society to participate, but it is inhibiting in terms of accelerating the speed with which you can implement the much needed development.
Thank you very much. You're watching Dialogue with Mr. Gwede Mantashe, Secretary General of the African National Congress, the ruling party of South Africa. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us. Welcome back, sir. You have a very powerful trade union in the South African Congress since the end of the apartheid. And to my knowledge, you have so many branches of the trade union competing for their influence, vowing to raise salaries for their new members, and that will somehow create an illusion that new membership will help you get more income without having to work very hard for the country, without having enough sacrifice. Is that true?
The reality of the matter is that trade unions in South Africa were part of the liberation movement. When the ANC was banned, trade unions for black workers were banned until they re-emerged in the 70s and became part of the liberation movement, revival of the struggle for freedom. Therefore, it's not something that comes after liberation. When we get the freedom, we had a number of trade unions who became part of the government, and we continue to the tradition. But the most important thing, the difference between a socialist system and a capitalist system is that trade unions are an intervention in the workplace where the relationship between the employer and the worker is very antagonistic and hostile, and the employer is very powerful for the workers, and those workers have to pull together their power to actually balance the power of the employer. And our system in South Africa remained capitalist, and therefore trade unions balance those relations.
You know, the late Iron Lady, a former British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, was against the trade union in Great Britain. She was not quite in favor of the labor movement in the process of privatization. What can we learn from United Kingdom in examining the relationship between the labor union and the government?
At the time, I was a trade unionist myself. That's where my background is. I don't think there's anything we can learn from Britain in respect of how trade unions were treated. They destroyed a very important union that I like called the National Union of Mine Workers. Totally destroyed it. And if you destroy the unions, you destroy the vehicle for workers to have a voice in a capitalist system where exploitation has no limit. And in my own view, I think trade unions are very important. I get worried in South Africa that unions have weakened a great deal. They're not as strong as they used to be. COSATU, which is in alliance with the ANC, is not as strong as it used to be. That worries me. I prefer a strong trade union movement because you can have a partner who is reliable. When you have an agreement with that partner, that agreement stands. When you have weak trade unions, even when you have an agreement with the union, that agreement doesn't stand. You still have to take extra responsibility for the execution of the agreement.
Trade union is fine. No one questions the integrity and the virtues of having a very powerful trade union to guarantee rights of the individuals and the income of the disadvantaged social groups one way or another. However, don't you think in a young democracy you need to have a strong man like Nelson Mandela, whose appeal of the charisma and the populism may serve as the force that could rally all forces of different political persuasion?
No. You see, you'll have to study the history of South Africa more in details to understand the real situation. Because if you go to South Africa, economic power remains with the ex-colonizers. South African majority still have very limited access to the wealth of the country. And therefore to talk of just peaceful coexistence without redistribution of that wealth will be a myth. There must be redistribution of wealth which will actually reflect the society in South Africa. Then we can talk of a model that will talk to coexistence of working people and producers of that wealth. If we can do that now, we'll produce the interests and the privileges of the oppressor and the colonizers. And therefore, we need strong unions at this point in time. We need to redistribute that wealth. We need to create more wealth. And only when there is a fair reflection of the distribution of that wealth can we talk of fairness.
There are many needs from bottom up. But what about the political will? For example, do you agree that from Thabo Mbeki to Jacob Zuma, current president of Africa, freely elected, they cannot match the huge influence of Nelson Mandela, and therefore it is very difficult for them to have the national reconciliation, which is a very important precondition for ensuring efficiency and rapid economic expansion. Therefore, South Africa is currently mired in maybe what is called the middle income trap. It's very difficult for South Africa to be listed as a highly developed industrial nation.
Black middle class was about 1.5 million people 10 years ago. It's up over 6 million now. We're a smaller country. We're not talking of 1.4 billion people, talking of 50 million people. And that growth, which is normally termed the middle class bulge, is changing the composition and the character of the population and the society in South Africa. That step is systematically changing the status of individual households, where those young kids come from and become professionals. We must invest in that. We'll change South Africa step by step, gradually.
Let's come back to examine what China can learn from our African brothers and sisters. We are having a stronger and stronger middle-class family, or in Chinese words, middle-income families. And their demand for social justice, law and order, rule of law would be very strong. With the use of internet, the mobile phones, do you think we're going to have a more united society or a divisive one?
It depends on how you manage it. My experience is that the more progress you make, the more demands you face. Where there is progress, people demand more. Where there is no progress, people have nothing to demand.
But if you live up to the expectations electorate, you run the risk of being the victim of populism. Look at Donald Trump, the negative impact of Donald Trump, as well as the controversial impact of a Brexit vote in Europe. I mean, in both cases, you face the very strong demands from not necessarily the well-educated middle class, but from the grassroots electorate, who say enough is enough. For professional politicians, they are liars, they are whatever in the United States in the presidential race. So the use of social media, as well as the growing dissatisfaction of the disadvantaged social groups, would be a big social problem, isn't it?
Let me give you two examples. You see, if you go to South Africa, you find a wave of protest in universities today. I always describe that as being victims of our success. Because the more we open higher education and have more kids from poor families in the institutions, the more they demand to be in those institutions in bigger numbers. When that happens, you become a victim of your own success. You know, apartheid, one of the things that is never explained about apartheid was about keeping blacks almost in modern slavery. We dreamt about electricity, we dreamt about clean water, we dreamt about houses. Today, we've taken the level of electrification, for example, from 39 in 1994 to about 86. Black South Africans having access to electricity, but that has not reduced the demand for electrification for the remaining 14%. Because when you receive development here, people, you raise expectations somewhere else. That's where populism comes in. We've given houses to the poor end of our population, over 3 million of them, free houses given by the state, but it has not reduced the demand for more houses from that section of society. And my own view is that the more you do, populism comes in the sense that they can whip up the expectations that are also generated by own successes. And that is a very important lesson for me.
We've been discussing the issue of co-prosperity, sharing dividends of globalization, as well as poverty alleviation through creation of jobs. But let's look at the issue of corruption. Now, all major political forces, ruling parties or opposition ones, face much the same challenge of rampant corruption without sufficient rule of law and oversight of the media, for example. This problem could be a major obstacle in the way of our progress. What can we learn from each other in strengthening the governance of the party?
One of the questions I have posed to the CPC is, what lesson can we learn from you where you can boldly declare that corruption and factionalism are an exception? In our situation, corruption and factionalism is almost a norm. And to me, you can't deal with corruption by talking. You can only deal with corruption by being able to deal with it aggressively, arrest, prosecute, convict. And it must be a punishable offense. If you are lacking on punishing corruption, you'll never deal with it. As far as we're concerned, is that is the biggest problem because it is stealing from the poor. Corruption doesn't steal from the rich. Corruption steals from the poor. It must be sternly dealt with because it is a very difficult problem. It is slippery, but it is dangerous.
It is indeed. what's happening in the United States captures media attention. It's either Black Lives Matter equally in gun-related violence, or the sinking of the middle class, as well as the rise of populism. So, do you think the United States has lost its appeal as a flagship democracy? Do you think there is something seriously wrong with the Western institutions when we talk seriously about what the future might hold for developing countries? Should we also always copy Western institutions blindly, or we should walk our own way?
Let me tell you, see, Western powers can only be happy if they dominate and dictate direction.
On their own terms.
On their own terms. My own view is that we should also develop our own mechanisms of dealing with problems. Look at their examples, what they've done, take what is right, and don't follow it blindly. For example, growing nationalism is not going to help the world. The world requires more and more soft boundaries where people can move freely, integrate, produce, and interpollinate each other with cultures and understanding. I can tell you that if you go to South Africa, you'll find areas where there is a visible presence of the Chinese people there. That is Chinatown. That's what it's called. In our elections, we had about 4 candidates who were Chinese in the local government elections. Some of them won, some didn't, but they are becoming part of that population. That is going to happen more and more. You are going to have a number of Africans in China. Others will stay here and become citizens. And the more we integrate and interpollinate, the better the world will be. The Western powers will not allow that. If you take Donald Trump, I don't know if he will win. If he becomes president, the world will be in trouble. Actually, the Third World War will be closer.
You're right. The issue of having free movement of human resources across the traditional borders is called into question by Western leaders. Thank you very much for being part of this meaningful dialogue.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.